Just give it a moment. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. Isn't it fun to have S.J. Rozan, whom I'm going to call Shira throughout this conversation? It's so dumb to call people like S.J. I know. I, I like
Well,
Shira
I don't know,
better.
works for me.
Oh, no. Right. Anyway, thank you very much, virtual audience, for joining us. And we are here to talk about the second book in a series that started out. What was the full title? Something Mr. Ma.
The Murder of Mr. Ma.
The murder. Oh, that's so euphonious. The murder of Mr. Ma. I really like that. Um, so this is a sort of a co-author enterprise. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your mysteriously absent co-author?
My mysteriously absent co-author hates to do public events. I'm sorry. He lives in Los Angeles. He was the publisher at Marvel Comics, and during the pandemic, Disney, who owns Marvel, laid off the comic book staff, not the movie people, because they were making a fortune because everybody was streaming the Marvel movies. But the comic books are sold in comic book stores, and the stores were all closed, so they laid off the staff. John Shen Yen Nee, whom I did not at the time know, had 70,000 other projects he wanted to do. And he called his friend Alex Segura, whom you know, everybody knows Alex, and said, "What do I do with all these projects?" And Alex said, "Call my agent." So he did. So I got a call from my agent, who was the same as Alex's agent, and Karen Odin's agent. And he said, "I just talked to this guy on the phone for an hour and a half, and I think he might be crazy. But I also think if he's for real, he has a project that's perfect for you and you'd enjoy it. Will you talk to him?" Now, this is the middle of the pandemic, so I'll talk to him. I'll talk to anybody. Why wouldn't I talk to him? He's better than the cat, And so I talked to him for an hour and a half, and I came to the conclusion that Josh was right on both points. He's crazy, and it was a perfect idea. John wanted a series of detective novels starring Judge Dee from the Tang Dynasty and Lao She, so that we could tell the story of the history of modern China, which is little understood in the West, through detective novels and kung fu. And I said, sure, why not?
Absolutely. I know. So is there a sort of a statement here that people in the comic book world are crazy?
I would not be a bit surprised.
I mean, I don't have much exposure to people in the comic book world, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but maybe to exist in comics, you have to be a little bit off-center.
They certainly are off-center. There's no question about it.
Right.
They're John's brain is like an explosion in a fireworks factory, and to keep him on you can't really. But when you ask a question, he will get back to you in 3 or 4 days with an answer you never thought of, and it's brilliant. So he's really, this has been a really fun project. One of the problems is that he lives in L.A. and I live in New York, and so we have to make an appointment to get together to talk about something. But it really is lots of fun. But he doesn't like doing the public events. Which,
well, if you're watching this, John, we're sorry you're
hi,
not
John.
Here, but good work. So I have to tell you that for forever, 50, 60 years, I'm a huge fan of Judge Dee and Robert Van Gulik's amazing books about Judge Dee, who was, in fact, a real judge in the Tang Dynasty. When I go to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, I make a special effort to go and look at the Tang Dynasty China, because they have that really distinctive kind of almost terracotta glaze with the brilliant green.
The three-colored.
The horses.
Yes,
yeah. I made Rob carry one home, a metal one from China when we were there. No, he lugged it along in his luggage. It was like, it lives still on our coffee table. But anyway, Judge Dee and those books actually should appeal to comic book people, because part of their charm was the line drawings that that Van Gulik inserted in the books. They're still in print they were for forever, the University of Chicago. I'm not sure.
I think they still are. And if not, it's only recent.
We still have them, and I try to encourage people. So much of what I knew about ancient China came from Robert van Gulik, who was a Dutch diplomat stationed in China, and it was a hobby for him to write these glorious books. So when I saw that Judge Dee is wandering around in this book in 1924 London, I had some difficulty in accepting that because he's really in the 9th century, but why not update him?
Well, let me interrupt you for a minute. We figured that people are moving Sherlock Holmes around all the time, so we could move Judge Dee, and he might enjoy it.
Absolutely true. Now, I will also say that Q Shalong, or Chu Shalong, I should say, author of many books that I truly love, a whole series set in Shanghai, has recently taken to writing Judge Dee too, and he has written, I believe, 2. He may be working on a 3rd, but he's really back in the 9th century. He is, as you might discern, Chinese, given his name, and he's a professor in Missouri. I can't remember the name.
He's in St. Louis at the university.
It's not St. Louis. It's whatever. Anyway, that's where he is, and he's been here for forever, and really risked, I think, his life if he were to return to China. By the way, he's written about Red China, so that's not going to be a safe thing for him to do. But I think it's interesting that right at the moment now, so we have the Judge Dee Mysteries by Van Gulik, we have Chu Shalong's Judge Dee Mysteries, and now we have your 2 mysteries. So it's really fun.
Yeah, Judge Dee he's a fabulous character. He was a real jurist. In those days in China, judges did their own investigations. So you came to the judge and you said, "This guy stole my cow," and he would send his guys out, or he'd go out himself. He'd interview people. He'd look for the cow, and he'd talk to the other farmers, and he would come to the conclusion that either you were right or you were wrong. And if you were right, the guy would get arrested and have to pay the fine, and possibly be whipped or whatever happened to guys who stole cows. And if you were wrong, then he would find the damn cow. This was the thing about Judge Dee, is he never failed to solve a case.
No, and he actually employed some forensics. One of his most famous cases is a woman whose husband died, and everybody sort of assumed that it was a natural death, but Judge Dee eventually found out that she had banged a nail into his, behind his hair. So it rattled when it became a skull. The nail rattled, and so, that's how he eventually. So it wasn't a quick solution. It took a while. Took a while for him to get to skull.
Right. But he did not give up.
That's right. No, they're wonderful. So the other thing I think is really fun about this book, and I don't know about any of you, but I love trains. I've just signed up, my husband and I, when we arrive in Singapore next February, happily arrive on the same date that the Orient Express is leaving from Singapore to Kuala Lumpur. So I said to Rob, and I thought he would resist, and he said, "No, great, go for it." So there's a huge luxury train movement that is coming back, or at least not just luxury, but just trains in general, especially all over Europe. So the Trans-Siberian Railroad was something that I thought from the time I was an undergraduate at Stanford and my professor, Ivan Ivanich Stenbach-Fermor, had escaped. He was a white Russian, had escaped across Russia using the old train to Vladivostok and came to San Francisco and then to Stanford. And I've always wanted to do that. So, in fact, the Trans-Siberian Railroad is what is today built upon the Chinese Eastern Railway, which is what this book is named for, or part of the plot, right?
Yeah, there was the China Eastern Railroad. It's translated a couple of ways, but that's one. Was a really important idea and then accomplishment in opening up the west of China, and it was a it was sought after by the Chinese, who wanted to own it. It was on their land, but also the Russians and the Japanese. Everybody wanted it because it would give you control of a big area in the north, and the part of the plot here is about that, the fight for that. But it also became a symbol of that three-way battle among China, Japan, and Russia that was about more than the railway. So, yeah,
Yeah, well, it was a critical incident in the Sino-Japanese War.
yeah,
And let's see, whatever the Chinese puppet government was in 1930 something or other.
yeah, the Manchurian
The
government.
Manchurian government, Manchukuo, that was it. They were able to take control of the railroad, and eventually Russia gave it back to China in 1952. But it opened up Harbin, and what. So the Chinese wanted to go west, but the Russians wanted to go, east. There's so much of what we know about Russia is they're always trying to open up a warm port, either through the Dardanelles or up in St. Petersburg or now Murmansk. I mean, when I was at Murmansk, it was 95, so believe me, they could open it up. But they've never put as much energy into their Pacific ports, which are huge. They have that, but to get goods reasonably across from Western Russia to Eastern Russia, you really needed a railroad. I mean, trucks weren't going to do it, especially in the early 1900s.
Yeah, yeah. In those days, the automotive prowess that the technology just wasn't there. The railroad was the thing, and the railroads were very efficient, given the options. And the China Eastern Railroad was it was a kind of model. It was spectacular, and everybody wanted it. But that's right, the Russians wanted to go that way. The Chinese wanted to go that way.
The Japanese wanted to expand west.
Well,
as well.
the Japanese wanted to expand. The Japanese wanted to take over China, and damn near succeeded.
Well, they did for a while. Yeah, pretty much so. So the reason we're talking about that is that in 1924, there is a whole, well, it's your book, you discuss it, but at heart, one of the big plot points in this book is about the railroad.
Yeah, that is, they don't know that in the beginning. They just know that the railroad, that is, Judge Dee and his chronicler, Lao She, who was a real Chinese writer who lived in London in the 1920s. And so we use him as the sort of Watson to Judge Dee's Holmes. They know in the beginning that there are rumors swirling around the railroad, but they don't know what they mean, what it's about. And they begin the book in a recovery mission for an artifact that is being handed off from a Russian to a Japanese, and they stop that. They get the thing back. They bring it back to its Chinese owner, and it turns out that all of this is involved with the railway. And with the Russian, the Russians, the Japanese, and the Chinese in London, who are kind of, it's one of the nexus points of this three-way battle, because each of these countries is the Japanese were afraid that the Russian Revolution and the Chinese abandonment of their of the emperor, of their aristocracy, would affect their own government, that people would start looking at the Japanese emperor and saying, wait a minute, nobody has emperors anymore. So they were anxious to undermine the Russian Revolution and the in China, it wasn't yet the nobody was paying any attention to the communists, but Sun Yat-sen had set up a democratic Republican government, and the Japanese weren't happy with that, nor were a lot of people looking for power in China, the warlords and all kinds of other people, nor were the White Russians, who wanted to restore the Tsar. So there was just everybody and his in-laws had an interest in grabbing power in the area.
Yeah, Plus, in any construction project, there's money involved, right?
Right.
Shura has written about construction projects in New York City, for example. So, you are more than familiar with big money following big ditches.
Oh, I like that. That's a great phrase. Yeah, yeah. Any time there is anything being built, somebody's paying for it, and somebody's making money doing it, and many other people are in the intermediate middleman. I have my palm out too position. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm pretty sure, Karen, you can correct me on this, but in 1924, isn't London really still the financial hub of the world? Or has it moved to New York by now?
Karen.
I don't know.
Karen's writing about 1920s London, so
I'm actually writing about 1870s.
oh, you're okay,
I'm still back there. I'm not.
right? Okay. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
I think
I-
even though the British took such a hit in the First World War, I think that London was still really the world, and we were still on the pound. The dollar did not become. It was World War II when the dollar became, the world currency, but it was still the pound then. So it would make sense that these people are gathering in London.
Yeah.
And also English is really kind of the lingua franca, she says, of the time. I mean, it still is because of the British Empire that many people, just like Latin would have been back in the Roman days, that people would come to Rome and many of them could do Latin.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
and
that,
we
and
have
that's
all
true
that going
because
on.
when the Russians and the Japanese and the Chinese in the book, the only language they have in common is English, and some of them don't speak it well, but it's the only way they can speak to each other. So yeah, there is that. And then the other thing is that of the Chinese languages, as a group, the Chinese in the book can communicate with each other in Mandarin to a better or worse extent, because some of them are not native Mandarin speakers. And in those days, today, all Chinese learn Mandarin, whatever their local language is. Mandarin is the official language, yeah. But in those days, that wasn't true. You learned Mandarin if you were high enough up in the education system, or if you worked at the court or whatever. So these guys speak Mandarin, but the sailors and the poor people did not speak Mandarin. Luckily, Judge D can speak practically any language in the world.
Of course he can. He's a polymath. Yeah, I mean, no question about that. So the dragon mace. I love the idea of a dragon mace. Years ago, you may not remember that Lisa C. started out writing mysteries before she wrote Snowflower and the Secret Fan. She wrote 3 wonderful mysteries.
Yeah, they're really good. I love those.
Loved them. I mean, that's why we've been friends since her first book. And the third one involved a Chinese mace. And they actually had it here in an exhibit at the Phoenix Art Museum, a similar mace. I remember Rob kept saying, why are you like glued to this glass case here in the Asian wing of the Phoenix Art Museum? But they actually had, is it a mushroom? It wasn't a dragon. It was some kind of a fungi, wasn't it?
Yeah, I forget what it's called, but there's a mace that's shaped like that, and there's a fungus on top. They don't say mushroom; they'll say fungus. But that's
Right.
and that is a symbol of power.
Right.
That's a thing.
It's an imperial scepter.
Yeah, and the whole thing sometimes is made out of jade, or it's made out of
Right.
It's very precious, and depending on whom it belonged to or whatever, you hold that, and that is the symbol of power. The one that we were using, it's called a dragon taming mace, and it has, in theory, magical powers.
Right.
And what it does, when taming is not exactly right, it doesn't stop dragons from doing evil things. It gives you the power to direct the dragon. So you tame it in the sense that it is now your dragon. So the dragon can, go after your enemies instead of its own enemies, or coming after you. So that's what this is. Now we don't have dragons in the book. We have enough. We have enough nonsense without that.
No, we
But
don't. But still, we have the mace. I have my notes here, which is why I picked up my phone. So I love this. Disguising himself as the fantasy villain Spring-Heel Jack, Judge D recovers the mace, the dragon mace, from Count Vladimir Voronov. God, it sounds like Boris. What was that? Boris Badenoch?
Boris Badenoch.
Remember Boris Badenoch? Vladimir Voronov and his Japanese conspirator who was, a mercenary called Isaki. Child's play, even as his capers bewilder his friends and helpers. So tell us about Spring-Heel Jack, because the British are so good at naming villains.
Yeah.
I love the way they do that.
Spring-Heel Jack, the Terror of London.
Right.
You can look the guy up. He was a villain who probably there was a guy who he was a Victorian guy, Spring-Heel Jack, and there probably was a guy who snuck up on women out of the dark, out of nowhere. No one saw him coming. Grabbed people. That this is his reputation. But what happened was, because they never caught him, his reputation grew and grew, and he was reputedly able to jump. This is the Spring-Heel part, but I mean, from he could jump from here to the top of the bookcase from a standing start, and then jump to the and
Olympic quality.
yeah. Oh yeah. And then he began to be used as a as a thing to scare children with, so they would go to bed. If you don't eat your beans, Spring-Heel Jack will come after you. That kind of thing. So he became this big, much bigger deal than he ever probably was. But he was this huge legend and extremely ugly. Thin and long nose and all those scary things. And it became clear right away to John when he wrote the outline, before he even met me, that Judge D couldn't run around London doing things because he would get recognized. He was Chinese. It would be too obvious. And John liked the idea of using a British legend, a London legend, against Londoners. So that was why we started using Spring-Heel Jack. And he's perfect for D, because D, actually being a kung fu master, can do all that stuff.
Yeah, you can actually spring up there, right?
Yeah.
Plus,
Yeah.
he's tall and thin.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
all those
So-
good things.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Count Vladimir Voronov claims that, in fact, he didn't steal the dragon mace, but it was given to him. And when it's returned to a Chinese lady, there's a big party, and it's just like shades of Nero Wolfe. You know how there would be a banquet or whatever it is. So there's a party, and somebody dies. Oh, love it. So you're not just doing Sherlock Holmes. You're stealing from Judge D and from Rex Stout. Yeah,
We prefer to consider these homages.
homages. Okay.
But yes, the Rex Stout thing is particularly funny because John loves food porn. John would write these guys, having meals after meals after meals after meals, and I sort of have to stop him and say, they can have a meal, but they have to do something at the meal. Something, it has to move the plot along, and then they can't have another meal for 100 pages. They can't be constantly going to. But he wants, every time they do have a meal, he wants the food described, which is fun for me. Because I do the writing. He does the outline and I do the writing. So he says, big banquet. And so I have to come up, and then there's the point in the first book where D, who's from the north, cooks his food for, he does a kind of modified banquet. So I had to do research into all this food. It was I know it was hard. It was
Did you
hard.
go to London just to make it really
No,
authentic?
but I may have to go soon. I may have to go for the third book because I'm running out of things I know about London without I haven't been in London for years.
Well,
And-
you were going to have a surprise. I certainly did last June when I went to Capital Crimes, and the hotel for Capital Crimes is right by St. Paul's. So that was wonderful, and it was great to be able to walk around that. But also, if you go that way, instead of that way to St. Paul's, you walk out on the Millennial Bridge. So why not, right? Beautiful day. The Thames is running. I walked out on the Millennial Bridge and I looked downriver towards the tower, and guess what? You can't see it. It is now completely surrounded by high rises.
Really?
Yeah, no, it's like almost invisible. And Covent Garden now looks like, I can't even describe to you what Covent Garden looks like. It's all like, Sapporo. No, what's the cosmetic chain? Yeah, it's Sephora. It's got, like
Wow.
flashing billboards in the whole bit. I mean, you really have to look to find the London of, even when I lived in England in the 1980s. You can't really find much of it anymore.
That is really
Including,
interesting.
I might add, Londoners, because it's so incredibly expensive that it's become more, for oligarchs and other things and all. So you'll have to work hard to find some of the 1920s. Have you gone to London to do some research recently? Am I wrong?
Yeah, so I was there about. So my daughter was doing a semester at Oxford in 2021, and I went over, and it was during COVID, so we weren't necessarily going into like a lot of shops and that kind of thing. But yeah, you could see the difference.
But there's been a really big building boom since coming out of COVID, and that's why I said I was really just could hardly believe it looking downriver, just tower after tower with, the sun glinting off the glass, and little tower of London, you can barely even see it. I know. I was really surprised.
Well, I did some hunting. One of the things that I did was I went to the Museum of the Docklands, which is actually housed in a Victorian warehouse, and it's got all the stuff. It has the lighter boats and it has the original things. But I did find myself feeling like I was hunting more than I had on previous expeditions. So yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
Well, I mean, every lot of London was lost in World War II, to the Blitz. I mean, that's why they were able to build the whole Olympic stadium and everything over in the East End, because it got completely flattened.
Well, that was one of the things, actually, when I started these. I talked to Laurie King, and I said, I'm going to have to go over, but it was the pandemic. And she said, no, you really don't, because a lot of what you're writing about has been gone since the war, 1920s London.
Well, I'm going to tell you, I think I can find it here, but an author named Alison, no, thank you, but that is a very good one. I love her books. Now, she just wrote a book called Fagin the Thief. Sorry, I'm blanking on it. If Patrick were here, he would come out, leaping out, Patrick Milliken, to save me, because he's used to that. Anyway, I'll think of her name in a minute. But she writes a, what's that thing you get where people, there's a whole, like Reddit or something, where people write, long things and you can sign up for them. I'm not sure if it's Reddit or
Substack.
something. Substack, thank you. It's Substack. So she's writing something called Dirtbags Through the Ages, which is hilarious. And so, I said I would subscribe to it, which I did. But that led me then to this glorious thing called the London Time. I'll have to look it up here. But this is a guy who actually colors like 17th century maps of London. He takes photos. He takes you all through. If you really want to do a deep dive into the history of London, this is your guy. And I'll have to. I'll put it in. I'll put it in an e-news next time. But I love it. Today he's looking at the palace, that Bedlam, which is the palace that Henry VIII, the only palace that Henry VIII actually built in Tudor London, which of course now has been completely paved over. But he's gone like through all the boroughs. It's amazing. So if you really want to dig into London history, this is the way to go. And I think that all of his previous Substack posts are available to you. So I just love it. I mean, it's so British. It's just wonderful. Anyway, right. So what happens? We have the banquet. We have somebody die, and that's about as far as we want to talk about the story.
Yeah, I mean, then they start investigating, and of course it gets more and more complicated. They also Judge D, the original, the real Judge D, had a group of people. He had a, an old family retainer, Sergeant Hung, who had been in the army, and then he had two reformed thieves with whom he worked. And so we have added two. We in the first book we had Sergeant Hung, and one reformed thief who hasn't reformed all that far, and in the second book we've added another character, a young woman who then starts working with him, and her dog. Okay, the dog. I got to tell you about the dog. The dog is a hound, a Shandong hound, and the dog came about because in John's original outline, they discovered that the mooncakes are poisoned because somebody has a pet and they feed the mooncakes to the pet and the pet dies. Probably a dog. I said, John, we are not killing the dog. He's, he said, hey, in the Hound of the Baskervilles, they killed two dogs. I said, I don't care. We are not killing the dog. And he said, but then how will we know the mooncakes are poisoned? I said, just hold my beer. And so it's obvious that the dog is a big lover of mooncakes. And when they offer the dog a mooncake, he won't eat it because it's poisoned. So that's a little plot point, but it doesn't matter because
It does. If you'd killed the dog, we might not even
well,
be
no.
here.
If it no, I mean we weren't going to kill the dog. I was not. That. I think there's a clause in my contract with John that says, if John wants to kill a dog, SJ can break the contract. Things. But anyway, so the young woman and her dog, and the reformed thief, and Sergeant Hung. Now we have the team complete, except that we have Lao She, and we also have that Cartwright is coming back. So we've made a slightly larger.
But isn't it always the way in a series that, the cast kind of keeps enlarging? And then you have to start making down the road choices about who gets any space in a book because they can't necessarily all show up every book.
Yeah. Well, and in the outline for the third book, there were some places where I thought, wait a minute, but we haven't seen so and so for pages and pages. But yeah, it's going to be a problem as we go on. John wants to set the fourth book in Paris, which I think is great. Except that now we have to get this whole crew of 6 people to Paris. And I don't know.
There was a cross-channel ferry. It's
No,
not
that's
that
not
hard.
the problem. But yeah, we'll have to figure out some reason for them all to be there. But yeah, that's what happens as you go on in a series, and that's especially when they're working as a group,
Right.
which in this case they are. So that'll be fun. But I'm sure John will come up with some brilliant way to do that.
So I'm gathering from that conversation that you're planning to continue writing the series, which is a question I always like to ask.
Oh yeah, we are. We're working on the third book now, and the way these are Soho Press books, and they only give one contract at a time, but they have asked for an outline of the fourth book in case they're thinking about maybe they want it. They're playing it very, but they wouldn't ask for that if they weren't interested. So yeah, we would like to keep going. John has some idea of where he wants to end it, which I believe is in the 60s. And for some reason, he thinks in the 60s, Dee has set up an office in Hawaii, which is fine with me. But it'll be some time before we get to the 60s because we seem to be doing like 2 months at a time, But I think we'll start moving a little faster.
You're going to move into spy drama during World War II?
I don't know. That's an interesting. The World War II. What the Chinese were up to in World War II is a really interesting. And Dee, of course, starts out working for the government of Sun Yat-sen, and when that government falls, Dee is no longer employed by the Chinese government. So what the Chinese are up to in World War II and what Dee is up to are really different things, or potentially different things. So I don't know what we're going to do. John has an encyclopedic knowledge of Chinese history. He's one of these people who knows much, much, much more than you do and doesn't understand that you don't know that much. So he will talk about things that you've never heard of, and you have to stop him and, explain that to me. And he starts talking about in the third book we have some important plot points about the warlords in the North, and he says at this point we should probably say something because it's important that the reader understand the conflicts among the warlords in the North. And I said, John, it's important that I understand, and I don't I need the fifth grader version of what was happening in the North at that point. So he probably has all of this stuff in mind. It just is.
All right, so let's move over to Lydia and Bill.
Oh, Lydia
What's
and
going
Bill.
on with Lydia and Bill?
I just turned in a book called First Do No Harm, which is a Lydia Chin book that is narrated by Lydia. Lydia and Bill are working on a case. A nurse is killed in a hospital. It's the hospital that Lydia's brother is the head of the emergency department in. And they arrest a guy. The guy they arrest is a friend of Elliot's, Lydia's brother. And so Elliot calls Lydia. And so they will be investigating. And of course, what happens, I was very interested in this whole hospital thing because a friend of mine was on the nurses negotiating committee for the contract at Mount Sinai, for the new contract. And she gave me a password so I could watch the live stream of the negotiations, which the nurses insisted on and management didn't want. And the nurses said, we are not negotiating with you unless all the nurses can watch. So I became a nurse and I watched, and it was kind of astounding because the lawyers you could tell they were doing their job for management. And it sort of didn't matter what management, that is, if they'd been working for CBS, they would be doing their job for the TV management. And if they'd been working for General Motors, they'd be doing their job for car, the automotive. It didn't matter to them that this was a hospital. And then my friend started telling me about, nurse supervisors who were arrested for this scam and this guy for the other scam. And I thought, my God, this is fabulous. You could write a whole book about crimes in a hospital without mentioning drugs or patients or Medicare fraud, all of this, stuff that you've heard about. But there's all this other stuff. So that's the book. There are no patients in the book. There are occasionally patients mentioned, but none of the medical stuff is what goes on in the book.
This is more or less the business side of
It's
the
the business side of running a hospital, and it's the potential for defrauding the business side of running a hospital.
Well, we have a whole thing going on here about people who claim to set up addiction centers, for the Navajo, basically. And turned out it was all for Medicaid fraud. They brought them down here, and then, they didn't give them treatment, and, now there's ongoing litigation. Well, lots of stuff going on about that. It's a huge amount of money.
Yeah, there is a huge amount of money in healthcare, and a lot of it is very loosely watched. And anywhere there's money that's loosely watched, I discovered this a billion years ago. Concourse has a similar theme where as long as you do the job they're paying you to do, you can steal money right and left because nobody's going to investigate what's going on because the job is being done. And this fascinates me. So eventually, in the stuff that's going on in First Do No Harm, somebody would have audited at least one of the scams. I mean, there would have been, they would have brought somebody in, but that particular scam has been going on for a couple of years, and the guy is making a lot of money. And as soon as the auditor came in, he would have disappeared. So, what the hell? And the thing that my nurse friend told me about, one of the nurse supervisors was arrested, but he got greedy. He had been running this scam for a while. This particular scam. I'm not going to tell you what it is because it's in the book. But he'd been running this scam for a while, and he decided this was really very easy, and he could just double his take by, and that was a mistake because they finally caught him. But boy, it's the bigger the organization, the easier it is to steal money from it, and hospitals are no different in that way. So that's the book.
When are we expecting that book?
I don't know. What month are we in now? April, and I just turned it in. I would say spring. It's likely spring. Yeah.
All right. And so you might have 2 books out next.
I might have 2 books out next spring. I would think that A Warning to the Curious, which is the next D in Lao, will not be April. It might be May. And I would think that First Do No Harm, more likely March. I mean, it would be nice if they were out at the same time, and I could do one
book tour,
one tour.
right.
But, and I don't know. I mean, I made both those dates up based on when I deliver, but having not finished A Warning to the Curious yet, I don't know. But that's. Oh, woo!
Well, how about I found it. I actually emailed it to you and to Shira. It's called London. The Londonist. Yeah,
Oh.
The Londonist Time Machine. And I'm telling you, it is absolutely wonderful. Also, I can tell you Dirtbags is truly outstanding.
That is a great name, Dirtbags Through the Ages.
I thought so too.
Yeah,
I thought
yeah.
I would pay her $60 to subscribe to her Substack about dirtbags just because the title was so
Yeah, really.
irresistible. And you know what? There really are a lot of dirtbags in history.
Isn't that amazing?
So, yeah, you don't even have to work hard to find them. But anyway, the Londonist, LONDONIST, Time Machine on Substack is what you want. And today is the Lost Palace of Bridewell. But I like maps, and I do think that his attempt to color in different boroughs with all kinds of highlights and all is just extraordinary. I had no idea there were so many boroughs today in London. 56. Who knew? Right, PK, do you have a question from the online audience?
Lots of questions. So depending on how many we have from the live audience, so as soon as S.J. Rozan mentioned food, everything, the questions just started popping off. So we got a hungry crowd tonight. So one of the questions was, what kinds of food did you have to research for this, you or John, and how has the food changed from the 1920s to modern day in comparison?
That's an interesting question. John is actually a big foodie. He lives in Los Angeles, and so every time I go out there, he takes me to some fabulous Chinese restaurant. He's half Chinese, as you can tell from his name, and so he really knows his Chinese food. I had to research the food of the North for D, but one of the interesting things about London in the 20s is that you couldn't get a lot of the Chinese ingredients. Sergeant Hung has a shop and he imports a lot of the spices, but you couldn't get the greens and you couldn't get the kind of rice that they use in China that they used then and that they use now. So it's a whole. It was a very kind of improvised Chinese cuisine, but you could get pork, which was important to the people in the north, and you could get fish, which they would steam. You could get good fish in London, but it was the research I did was both in books, cookbooks, and online. And I lived not far from Chinatown, so I would go down there and do some research. It was kind of great.
How much much research did you have to do to prep before writing the Railway Conspiracy? How much do you have to kind of get down in terms of the history, etc., before actually being able to write the book?
John does the outline, and so I will get a thing that, for example, this the Japanese artist Yoshio Makino is in this book, and John has him at the dinner party, and then has one other scene with him. I didn't know anything about him, so I had to research that character, so that or that person, he was real, so that I would know what kind of a character this was that we were using. I always have to research geography because John is not an expert in London geography, and so he'll say, this is, they have this very, very classy home, and I have to decide which neighborhood this classy home is in. He at one point he said, this we have to have a big fight in some really cool place. Okay. So I have to find a really cool place to have a big fight. The one of the best pieces of research that you'll see here, there's a car, right? I needed a Bentley from 23 or 24, a very up-to-date car of the moment. And what do I know about cars? I mean, zilch. So I called the Automotive Museum in Saratoga, New York, and I said, you don't happen to have a 1924 Bentley? And they basically laughed at me. But then they said, we do have a 32 Bentley. Would you like to come up and see it? So I went up there, and I met the best nerd ever. People who love one particular thing. This guy knows everything about early cars, and he showed me on the 32 what would have been on the earlier cars and what wouldn't have, and I learned so much about early cars, including the fact that the very early ones didn't have a driver's side door. You came in, and of course the driver's side is on the other side. In England, you came in, both the driver and the passenger came in and slid across the bench. And this is like fabulous. They also almost never, now ours has a roof, but they almost never had roofs. And because they were horseless carriages, but they were carriages. So you drove around in the rain and got rained on, just like you could ride your carriage in the rain and get rained on. And it was a long time before they figured out it might be good to have a roof. And even then, it was a leather, a canvas thing that came up. The hard roof didn't come till the 30s. So I played a little with that because I needed a roof. But a lot of research like that, where John will say, we need a fabulous place, and I have to find one. So it's terrific. The rabbit holes are just
Finally from Italy, we've got Stefania watching at 1 a.m. again, and she was curious if there was a tradition that particularly caught your attention that you fell in love with.
if there was a
Tradition. When you were doing your research for this book that you might have fallen in love with, or something that other than, because you were mentioning she actually asked about a fun fact, but I think the horseless carriage was a pretty good fun fact.
That was an excellent fun fact. A tradition, no, that I didn't know about Chinese.
Or
life
one that you might love now that you've picked up from your years of writing. I mean, so there might be something that calls to you or called to you.
You mean in writing, Stefan? Do you mean how to write, or do you mean that
In
what
general,
was the
and like
tradition that people in the book would be celebrating?
Tradition in which the characters from the book would be celebrating, or in general, the Chinese group or something like that.
My favorite. Now, I didn't learn this in research. precisely research, but I learned it hanging around with my Chinese friends, looking for help in the minutia of Chinese life. In this is in New York. This is for Lydia. But I learned that, and I do this in this book. I mean, in the first one too. When you are serving tea to a Chinese person, they will often tap their finger on the table. When we do that, that means, I'll have more. When they do that, it means thank you. And the reason for that is an old legend that the emperor one day decided to go about the people and see how things were, and he took a couple of guys with him, and he disguised himself as a peasant, and they went to a tea shop, and they ordered tea, and one of the manager brought the tea, and the emperor started to pour for his guys, and one of the guys started to bow, and the emperor said, "You can't do that. Don't do that. Everybody will know it's me." And the whole point is we're in disguise here. But the guy couldn't resist thanking the emperor in some. So his finger bowed. He made his finger bow, and that is the beginning of this tradition, which people will still do. If you go into a Chinese restaurant in New York, in Chinatown, or any really dense Chinese area, people will still tap the table if you pour them tea. And I had never even seen that, or I'd never noticed it until my friend did it, and then they still do it in China. So it's in the book, not this one, the first one, I guess. In this one, they just tap the table. We don't talk about it. So that I think is one of my favorite. My favorite things.
It's always that question in England, where does the milk go? Do you put the milk in the cup and then pour the tea, or do you pour the tea and then put in the milk? And it's a big deal.
Yeah.
I don't actually know the answer. You probably do.
You're supposed to put the milk in first, which makes no sense because how do you know how strong the tea is? I don't know. The other argument is the shape of the scones, triangle or round.
Oh, yeah, that's pretty serious.
It just depends on your baking pan, but whatever. The tea thing is interesting. And then I've been to Japanese tea ceremonies, and tea is a ritual,
Oh, yeah.
depending on where you are, for sure. Anybody here have a question they would like to ask?
Karen.
So I know that you're being very modest about how much you know about China, that you actually do tours in Chinatown. I know this. Where did your fascination with China begin?
Yeah, I do New York City Chinatown tours. That is true. This is the famous S.J. Rozan Chinatown tour. If we don't know it, we make it up. I don't know the answer to that. It's an interesting thing where my fascination with China began, because I feel like I have always been interested. I don't remember my first Chinese opera, but I know I loved it, which a lot of even Chinese don't so much. But I can tell you this, which is a kind of approach from another angle. When I was a kid, there was one Chinese family in the neighborhood, and they had a kid in almost every grade, not my grade, but my brother's. And this was Eugene Lee, and Eugene and my brother got to be good friends. Eugene was over at the house all the time. My brother would go over to his house. And Eugene's father had a restaurant, the House of Lee. And my father would take us there for dinner, and we would have egg rolls and stuff. And so I grew up with Eugene and his family. And I think what happened was, as I became interested in China and the Chinese and Chinese art and Chinese music, and it never occurred to me that this was exotic, that it was incomprehensible, that it was difficult to learn. It was like anything else. If you're interested, you could find books, and you could, go to museums, and you could learn this stuff. And so I sort of fed that interest because I didn't know this was mysterious. And so I went to college at Oberlin. One of the reasons I chose Oberlin is because it had a historic relationship with China. And there were Chinese scholars coming over all the time. There were people going over all the time. And that was that. I lived for a semester, 2 semesters, in Asia House, which was where you lived if you were particularly interested in the history and art. And I took courses in Chinese poetry, but it goes back further. It goes back to high school and junior high, and I don't know how it started, but I do know that knowing the Lee family gave me the idea that it was just like anything else you wanted to learn. You just, they're, you knew these people, you could just, Eugene's father talked funny, but my grandfather talked funny, their food was interesting. The food my grandmother made was interesting. It wasn't what my mother cooked, but it was interesting. So I never had the idea that there was anything inscrutable or all those adjectives they use people use about the Chinese that never crossed my mind. So
Anyone else? Yeah.
For editing between the two of you, what was the process like editing, or did you do?
John sends the outline, and then we have a lot of conversation about the outline because he tends to put in everything as though all his knowledge has to go into this book, and so I have to prune. And then once we've got that down, I will send him chapters as I write them to make sure that I have the voice and that the characters are doing the right things and that kind of thing. And every now and then he will come back with, how about we do this? Or, this character, ooh, let's give him a bigger role and do that kind of thing. When the book is done, we send it to our agent, to Josh Getzler, who is actually a really good editor. He started out in editorial, and he will say, it needs more of this, and, this isn't funny, actually, and that kind of thing. And so if John agrees with that, then I will rewrite according to what Josh wants, and then it goes to Soho, and our editor there, Taz Ernoff, who was the one who told me that the count was Boronov, not Borowski, which was my original. She said, not ski, that's Polish. Okay, all right. Because Taz is Russian. I just lucked into that. But then she actually edits, and so her edits come back, and John and I sit down and say, well, Soho wants this, and they don't want that, and what shall we do about that? And where we push back and where we take it. So that's the process. Now this co-writing process is not the co-writing process everybody uses. A lot of co-writers do it this way, where one writes the outline and one writes the book, but a lot don't. A lot do it chapter by chapter, or there's lots of different ways to do it. I don't think I could do it any other way besides the way we do, because I like to have my pause on the narrative, on the dialogue, and if John wants things changed, I want him to tell me how he wants them changed. I don't want him to change them because the flavor gets all messed up. Luckily,
it would interfere with your voice.
Yeah. And luckily, he feels the same way. He feels he's not a writer. He's an outliner. He's an idea guy. He's what?
He's providing the scaffolding, and then you're.
And then I'm making the building.
Yeah,
exactly.
Exactly. That's how it works. But she's right. Every co-author situation is different. It's a lot easier now when you can trade stuff back and forth, in PDF or whatever you're working in, than it was when you had to do it, like mailing pages.
Oh yeah,
and
yeah.
retyping or whatever it is. Oh Lord, So computers have really made, and the internet made it enormously easier to do these
co-write,
kinds of projects.
To
That's
collaborate.
For sure. Right.
That's absolutely.
Yep. So,
Anyone
you all.
else? Is that it?
I think so. Thank you all very
Okay.
much for coming
Oh,
tonight.
okay.
Whoa.
Yeah, the two Detective D. Yeah, the Detective D movies. I did not like them. I
Even risk them.
Yeah.
No, right.
yeah.
Yeah,
And
no.
yeah, they're
would
not
be
they're
kind
not
of-
my vision.
No. No, and I don't think that Chinese kung fu movies or whatever. I mean, what was that? Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Or
Yeah,
one of
yeah.
my favorite movies. I don't know how many times I've watched
It's
it. I just
wonderful,
loved it.
yeah.
Love the martial arts.
I-
And there are martial arts in these books, too.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
want to say that this about the martial arts in these books. My martial arts consultant acts out all the parts. He says he says even the puppy. That dog is no puppy, but he thinks of it as a puppy. There's nothing in the book that couldn't actually be done. There's no wire flying, and like in the movies, you see all this stuff. You'd have to be a big expert to do it, but everything in the books could be done by an expert. Because what we didn't want to hear is don't be ridiculous. That's impossible, and nobody could. And they do fight 8 guys at once. And it's where 2 of the guys will come at them and they knock them down, and then 2 others will. This is how it happens in the movies and in
It's
books.
Jack Reacher, for heaven's sake. So
Yeah,
it all-
really,
it all
yeah,
works
yeah.
out, right?
So,
all right.
but
Well,
yeah.
all right. Once again, I
Thank
will
you
say,
so much.
Thank you
Thanks,
very much
everybody,
for
for
coming. Let's
coming.
have a
Thank you,
round of
thank you.
applause for Shira. Virtual audience,
Thank you
very
online.
much for joining us. And if you'd like to have her sign a book and take photos or whatever you'd like to do, please do.
And go home and eat your Chinese food.